The calmest voice in a chaotic room often has the most power. And authority reads as steadiness, not decibels, which means the loudest person in the meeting is usually telegraphing the opposite of what they think they are. Look at any tense professional environment. The dynamic usually plays out like this. A stable baseline of conversation gets disrupted by a highly erratic, escalating presence. When a competent professional feels their expertise is being challenged in a group setting, an immediate instinct kicks in. They push harder. They accelerate their rate of speech. They raise their volume to talk over the interruption, trying to physically dominate the acoustic space. The result is almost always the same. You leave the room entirely drained, and despite making the most noise, you realize the group didn't actually hear a word you said. We are going to dissect the behavioral mechanics behind why this specific instinct fails so reliably, and look at how you can engineer a much more effective response. Because authority is not an acoustic property you can measure in volume. It is a systemic property measured entirely in behavioral regulation. To understand why volume fails, we have to look at how human neurobiology tracks social environments. Our brains are constantly and rapidly scanning the people around us to determine threat versus safety. When tension rises in a meeting through crosstalk, short tempers, or aggressive questioning, every person in that room experiences it as a biological provocation. How you handle that provocation depends on your margin. Margin is a behavioral indicator that signals to others that you have excess capacity and multiple options at your disposal. If you maintain your regulation while the rest of the room spikes into chaos, you broadcast a high level of margin straight into the group's unconscious threat tracking systems. Think of high margin as a resilient structure. When the chaos of a provocation strikes it, the system absorbs the impact. It registers the hit, but it maintains its shape and state completely. Compare that to a low-margin response. Here, the person's volume and pace escalate. Their behavior mirrors the chaos of the room, and their structure breaks apart. To everyone else in the room, this mirrored escalation does not register as dominance. It registers as desperation and anxiety. When your colleagues detect that you are out of options, their own threat systems activate. They go on the defensive, making it biologically impossible to absorb the substance of your message. Speaking loudly without underlying steadiness broadcasts vulnerability. It proves to the room that you have lost control of the situation. When professionals run out of margin under pressure, they default to two extreme failure modes. The first is escalation. This is the attempt to meet volume with volume, trying to overwhelm opposing force with equal force. But pushing back forcefully doesn't command respect. It triggers immediate psychological resistance from whoever is challenging you. Because no one is regulating the tension, the interaction rapidly spirals out of productive bounds. The immediate result is severely damaged team cohesion. There is also a secondary, long-term consequence to chronic escalation. You are actively training your colleagues to game your reactions. They learn exactly how to trigger you on purpose. The second failure mode is freezing. This happens when a person completely shuts down or retreats into a rigid, icy silence. People often mistake this coldness for a display of power or intense control. It isn't. To the threat tracking systems of everyone else, going cold reads as deep insecurity. Or worse, it reads as active disdain for the group. Broadcasting disdain isolates you. It forces the room into a defensive posture, making everyone feel unsafe and unwilling to collaborate. Escalation and freezing are the exact same mechanical failure. Both are an inability to regulate the tension of the environment, and both result in a total loss of authority. There is an optimized alternative to these failure modes, a behavioral posture known as warm clarity. Warm clarity is constructed from three distinct mechanical pillars. The first pillar is direct language. You communicate without qualifiers, over-explaining, or defensive filler words. The second is a steady pace. This requires a conscious, active refusal to let the agitation of the room accelerate your natural rate of speech. The third pillar is bounded empathy. This is the ability to explicitly acknowledge the tension in the room without absorbing that tension into your own delivery. In practice, this means validating a colleague's frustration about a tight deadline while simultaneously holding absolute boundaries on the project's scope. Maintaining these three pillars neutralizes chaotic conversations. It provides a predictable baseline the room anchors to. Instead of you getting pulled into their chaos, the agitated individuals are forced to subconsciously adapt their behavior to match your regulated baseline. Warm clarity establishes control by proving your internal state cannot be compromised by external noise. Let's look at how to apply this structurally, starting with the mechanics of negative space, specifically the strategic use of silence. Inserting a deliberate, rhythmic pause immediately following a hostile or chaotic interjection sends a clear biological signal. That pause proves to the room that the provocation failed to rattle your threat system. You are safe enough to take your time. You can pair this silence with a conversational tactic called closing loops to create strict structural boundaries around your argument. The framework for closing a loop is highly specific. You explicitly state what you are proposing, and then you immediately state what you are absolutely not proposing. Explicit bounding like this removes ambiguity. It creates intense predictability in your position, eliminating the gray areas that drive anxiety in group dynamics. When you define clear boundaries, the group's unconscious need to fill uncertainty with loud noise drops off. Closed loops and deliberate pauses function as structural dampeners. They mechanically strip away the friction that fuels a chaotic room. Authority relies on predictability and regulation. It is never a function of acoustic dominance. You can test this thesis directly during your very next high-friction professional conversation. When you feel the room begin to escalate, apply the first physical instruction. Intentionally lower your speaking volume by exactly 1 notch. Then, apply the second mechanical constraint. Mandate the insertion of 1 full, silent stop between your sentences before you continue speaking. Observe the immediate behavioral data. Watch as your agitated colleagues stop pushing back against the noise and instead physically lean in to listen. If you take one thing from this, try 1 notch quieter and 1 beat slower on your next hard conversation. Authority is often felt as steadiness, not